Training is important, but something that we have found is that usually we think about face-to-face interviewing. And face-to-face interviewing with a cell phone in your hand is actually very unfriendly. Because what you see is you actually end up having a person with a cell phone in his hand, could I borrow yours? or looking at the top of the head. So that is very unfriendly. Actually, we have found that it's much more interesting and enables better communication when interviews are done side by side.
One example of how the phone has changed the respondent's behavior is it's in Somalia. Actually, we've had respondents wanting to sit next to the person. So instead of being in this format where you're facing me, the respondent often will come and sit next to the person and want to watch this device.
Because then there is communication between the two people, but the interviewee can actually see what is going into the mobile phone. They are part of the interview process rather than being outside the interview process, and they don't feel that the machine is taking all the information without them knowing what is going into it.
So I don't think we want to hide the technology from respondents. I think sharing it with them and showing them what it is and what it isn't allows them to be more at ease. The last thing you want to do is say, sorry, you have to sit over there. I've got my black box here. You know, that's not going to help people have a comfortable, relaxed interview where they feel more able to give you frank answers. So sometimes you have questions where you don't want to read the responses out. So that might be an issue. Maybe you allow it most of the time and just say, I'm sorry, I've got a series of questions where I have responses, but I need you not to see those, otherwise it might affect your answer. So if you don't mind, I can show you the answer once you've given the answer.
I would probably have two screens. One that is a text screen, so that the person can read the question, followed by the actual question that gives the options. It turns out that we have the two stages.
Phones are not uncommon. I have seen in northern Kenya women in traditional dress that hasn't changed for decades, if not hundreds of years. They have two things around their neck that indicate they're in the 21st century. Their Kenyan national ID card and a feature phone. So phones are commonplace, even in the most unexpected places. Tablets, I think that's much less common. And therefore, pulling out a tablet just looks like slightly more intimidating. I mean, you're sitting there with a cell phone in front of you. It doesn't feel, I don't know whether you're just waiting for the next social media message or you've got a bunch of questions in there. One of the things I didn't mention before was the change in the role of a supervisor. And I haven't quite got this particularly in my head.
There's one challenge for which I don't have an answer, and it is how to best use the time of the supervisor during the field work. Because in the past, the supervisor had to do a lot with managing paper, collecting paper, checking things on paper. Now things are on a mobile phone. When the supervisor is checking answers on the mobile phone, the interviewee cannot be interviewing using that mobile phone. What do we do in terms of the changes? How do we keep track of the changes that the supervisor has made after the interview has finished? Is that the best function of a supervisor? How do we best enable a supervisor to help us managing the field work and improving the quality of the data that is being collected, now that a lot of the work could be done, if we have smart forms, could be done by the technology. And we are still learning a lot about that.
And I'm seeing teams now that are increasingly going out without supervisors. So if you've got all of the data validation logic built into the form, if you have the sample built into the form, you have replacements built into the form, maybe you even have previous information about the respondents that you're trying to find, which may be even a GPS location. The role of the supervisor changes, I think, or I think, becomes more limited. Of course, a good supervisor would shadow in the beginning, particularly at the beginning of a survey, sit but with an enumerator and just literally watch their style of enumeration, because something we can't tell from the data is, did they just put their head down, just sort of mumble the questions out as quickly as possible, just scroll through, or as I've seen, again in the pool, an enumerator that knew the questionnaire so well, he just would glance. He had an ongoing conversation with the person, and there was never any significant pauses. Either the respondent was speaking or the enumerator was speaking. And he made it that he had so much eye contact with the respondent, he was barely looking down the phone. He knew the form very well, he knew the sequence, and he engaged them in a flowing conversation, and it was fantastic. A rare skill, but one that we would all aspire to, so you don't feel like you've been enumerated, you feel like you're having an engaging conversation about a sensible range of topics that link together in a conversational way. That goes back to form design. Once you're on an area of inquiry, rather than leave it and come back to it later, it feels like, something that would be less stressful and tiring to respond, just to investigate that to its conclusion.